Okay, good morning. Happy Sabbath.
Good morning. Happy Sabbath.
Okay, apologize that my board isn't in full view when I had done a mock setup. It was working fine, but I can't find my little attachment to make it fit. So we're dealing with what we've got right now. So we are, thanks. So we're reviewing Elder Parminder's third presentation, third study from the Arkansas camp meeting. The date, I believe, is August 27th. It's on the recording anyway. August 27th of 2023, where he's talking about what does equality look like personally and politically. We watched starting at minute 48 and on last night at Vespers. So if anybody has questions, that's the portion of the video needing to be reviewed. Before minute 48, he made a few big points that I want to, I guess, bring to everybody's mind as we go through this today. He spoke about the new gurus. It was a 10-part presentation series that featured, the first part featured Steve Jobs and then several other people as they were, with Steve Jobs in particular, Elder Parminder emphasized understanding this concept of new gurus simply because Steve Jobs wanted the iPhone to be that guru for everybody, to facilitate a personal experience with God that everybody could have on their own. And Elder Parminder, or at least the point that I picked up, was he was contrasting this with the movement. The new gurus having a personal experience, whereas within the movement, we're having a group experience. So this is why it's important that we're all on the same page with things, that we all are talking amongst ourselves and talking with open hearts, open minds, to get an accurate picture of what the kingdom is and what our role in the events presently. So there were two lines that Elder Parminder brought out first. I'm going to talk first about the, I guess, the standard, what he called kind of our old model, so to speak. So he brought out that we have two models. We have the Eden to Eden model, which Elder Tess really helped to bring forward for us to flesh out, where we are shown the three curses and how we are healing those, how we are encountering their, how we're being revisited with them, but also how we're being prepared through these three steps within our time frame, race, worship, and gender sexism, in order to prepare us for this coming test, for the Sunday law, as we had come to understand it on the old line, where we have first Miller, the Millerite line, 1798, the time of the end, 1840, which we in discussion came to be 2001. I think it might have been Penny said it was the arrival of the second angel. And then we have this time period in our history, 2001 to the Sunday law. In Millerite history, it's the 1840 to 1850 time. Close of probation, 1861 in Millerite time. Second Advent, in 1863 in Millerite time. Does anybody have questions over that before I go on? Everybody's understanding how we arrive at that, how we are using it in this illustration. Okay. So the main purpose that Elder Parminder brought up the new gurus And the whole point behind this study is so that we have a better, a clearer understanding of what the personal and political mean, what it means for the personal experience to be political, and what it means for the political experience to be personal. And then how we began this discussion was to look at what we understand equality to be, since equality, we're lining up, or he showed us that we're lining up the Sunday law with the test of gender and sexism. So we looked into what equality meant at the beginning. Who can tell me, either based on your recollection of the study that Elder Parminder did, or just in our conversations last night, or just in general, any new thoughts? What does equality look like in the beginning? This is where feedback is required.
According to Ellen White, according to what Elder Parminder was saying, it was Adam was taller, stronger, had more ability to do certain things than Eve.
Okay. Anyone else? When Elder Parminder asked about riches, anybody? Okay, well, I guess that's later. That's in heaven. So let me go back to the beginning. What about before Eden? Sarah brings up that Adam named all the animals. That was discussed in the video in our original study. What we found through Spirit of Prophecy is that the animals were named before Eve was created. So those responsibilities of naming the animals, that wasn't a choice after Eve was created. So we're looking at the creation of Eve and the equality. This is one example anyway. We can go even further back and look at the equality or lack thereof between Jesus and Lucifer, as Elder Parminder did. But right now we're in Eden with Adam and Eve, and they both worked in the garden together, is what Spirit of Prophecy confirms. So they had shared responsibilities. But Eve was, by definition, if Adam is taller, by definition, she's shorter and weaker. But as we also talked about last night, is this true in all cultures? The African cultures, it's not true. Women are just as strong, capable of doing everything that the men would normally do when they're not at war, not in the military training. So this is kind of where my question of how much of this equality or inequality is built in through the lenses of patriarchy. And that's not going to be a question that we're going to answer today. But there is the point that I think Elder Parminder was making. I just saw somebody else made a comment. In Africa, women do all the hard work, says Sarah. Okay, and Lily says Adam was created first. Oh goodness, I missed a whole bunch. Okay. So Adam named all the animals. Adam was created first. In Africa, women do all the hard work. Mary says Adam was older. Eve came out of Adam's rib. Correct. Okay, so we have the rib to contend with. Because as Elder Parminder pointed out, if you are building anything, is it best to take when you're building a new house, but you have an old frame to a house, do you use that frame, or not even the whole frame? Do you take just a board of that old house and use it to build the new house? Anybody?
No.
Right. So this is where Elder Parminder is trying to get us to think of what this means, because we have this in our consciousness, in our awareness as a group. And Susie asks, if it's in good condition, why not use the old board for the new building? Good question. And maybe that's a little bit too much of the detail, because there's always going to be, not examples, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. So, but as a whole, general building practices, and Elder Parminder brought up a really good point. I don't know if any of you had thought of this also. Yes, Adam was in good condition. He was practically brand new. But just in constructing anything, you don't necessarily use old material to construct a new thing. Sound building practices would call for new materials, for new things. So I think this question is just to help us to think, help us to understand God's mind, help us to think, okay, why is God showing us this parable? Why are we needing to understand that Eve came out of Adam? She wasn't made from new dust like Adam was. Let me read Sarah's. Okay, and he mentioned that if we take the equality as we vision it, we could create a socialist government. Right, and I'm not entirely remembering all of that conversation, but so maybe you might help me if I stumble in understanding what you're meaning. Where socialism means equality for all, equal money, equal opportunity for all. And Eve, like there is built-in inequality in our beginnings. We're trying to make sense of this. We're trying to understand what God is seeking for us to understand. What lessons do we take from this? What do you all think?
Well, you started asking earlier about heaven, and I remember him talking about, we were talking last night too about how Lucifer was basically, he wasn't, I mean, when you compare him and Christ, they're basically equal in many ways. So, which is why he got jealous. And so perhaps that was why, and this is what I thought, way back when he first taught it, perhaps that was why he didn't make Adam and Eve completely equal. Maybe he was trying to prevent the same war from happening. If we had been completely equal to Adam, it'd be like, like Russia and the United States, they're very equal in many ways, strength and power wise. And if they really got to, fighting with each other, it would be just oblivion.
So somebody mentioned last night in our discussion dominance, that one of the lessons to learn is not to seek dominance. I think that might have been David.
It was me that did that, said that.
Bob? Okay.
And I
Do you
also,
want to
I just
elaborate?
want, yeah, when we look at equality, I think in my perspective is Elder Parminder is trying to get us to realize what really is true equality, because obviously we can look at certain things, even if you looked at the elements that everything is made from on this planet, not even going down to the atoms, just looking at elements, you can say that, you know, in order for gold, if something's made out of gold, then another piece of gold is the only thing that's equal to gold. It's not the same as silver. It's not the same as lead. It's not the same as you know, iron. And I'm only going with metals. I mean, you could compare all the different elements. They have different things that they're used for and put together with, and so I think, I don't know, I'm not trying to make any judgment whatsoever, but I think that I know even my own perspective of equality, as God wants it to grow, for us to understand what that means, because equality doesn't mean that because in the case of another human being, just because one has other abilities that the other one doesn't have, whether it's physical strength or size, or whether it has to do with privilege. He mentioned we talked about the 144,000 being able to go, and the only ones going into the temple. And so we see that we have to understand what equality means, even with all these different attributes and all these different things, that there's still a level of equality there that we have to see. And I don't want to throw too much into this equation at the moment, but I have to realize that, you know, when you talk about the war in heaven and what happened with Lucifer and him thinking that he was so equal with Jesus, and then all of a sudden his understanding of equality, well, obviously has to be wrong, because he's thinking, okay, there is no equality here because I'm not being treated the exact same way. And so he's thinking that it's not equality. And in fact, God, with Jesus being Michael the archangel, in so many ways was equal. But even if you compare Jesus in his form as Michael, you know, Lucifer looked way bigger and stronger and beautiful and everything else. And so I think we have to understand, just like they had to understand, what is equality, what really is equality when it comes down to it. Because, and then the point that I have to throw in is that out of all the things that God ever created in the entire universe, we know that all the things that he created all in some way reflect his character or who he is. They all do. And yet, because God is infinite, he could never stop creating, because he's infinite. But what he did, the pinnacle of his creation, was he created humanity, and it's the only thing that God made in their own image. So there is some level of equality that humanity shares with God that the whole rest of the universe does not. And yet there's got to be some, I think we just have to understand, equality doesn't mean that people have equal bank accounts, or that they have equal strength or size or anything. And I know that's kind of where I think Elder Parminder is trying to get us to think. But those are just a couple of thoughts. Thank you.
So one thing that I'm distilling from what you said is that humanity shares its nature with God. There's
Yes.
something different that humanity has than the angels. So in the other creations that God has. I'm wondering, thank you, Bob. I want to share some more of what was written in the chat. So Anna says, was that to show, I'm guessing the rib, was that to show how they intrinsically needed each other? It wasn't a bone from the foot. One other question or thought that came to mind about the rib, what's the function of ribs? helps you to breathe, helps to protect the heart,
Heart.
the lungs, the heart, right. So maybe that's giving another insight into this specialty of women, protecting the heart of humanity. That's not something, it's just a thought that I had. Okay, and Julia says diversity. Julia, if you have a second, if you don't mind speaking up to what you mean by that. And then Sarah says, I think God saw what happened between Christ and Lucifer, created competition, and he didn't want the same to happen to Adam and to Eve. So that might be where we're seeing that Jesus, okay. But I think, so if I'm understanding what you're saying, Sarah, that Adam was made different from Eve to disrupt the spirit of competition that Lucifer had with Jesus. But I think what we're seeing more as a group is that the story of Lucifer and Jesus really very directly tell the story of Adam and Eve, maybe. Lucifer, not that Lucifer was created first, but that's maybe how Lucifer saw things, that he had the more important job, the more important responsibilities. Jesus appeared like he wasn't maybe doing a whole lot, or it certainly wasn't equal to God until God told everyone that that was how the kingdom was set up. Any other thoughts? Okay, Julia says diversity, God's creation is very diverse. Yes. So, and this is maybe, so where your comment, Julia, took my mind is that if we look at Adam and Eve as two bicycle gears, we're all familiar with how a bicycle operates. In order to, a lot of, unless it's just a single speed bike, a lot of bicycles have multiple gears. So if there's diversity, then Adam is one gear and Eve, or the rest of humanity after Adam, could be all of the other gears. That's kind of what my mind creates from what you just said, that there's more than one way of accomplishing something, maybe. So this is why Eve was created, and maybe this is why there's a counterpart to that. A counterpart, maybe not an identical copy, but something that aids in getting the job done. I don't know if anybody else has any other ideas or comments. Okay. Is this confusing more, or are pictures coming a little bit more clear of what Elder Parminder is what God is trying to have us to see? Everybody's stunned and not saying anything.
So the story in heaven explains the story in Eden, why there wasn't equality from the beginning of Eden. And I think we've been believing all along that, when we go to heaven, that's all going to be worked out. There's finally going to be equality, and that it's actually possible, but not in, our lifetime on earth, that it's not going to happen. And so
You're
what's,
saying that these are things that people have believed, or that
I
these are
think this
things
is
that we,
this is the, you know, the understandings that we've gained about this, at least me anyway. That no matter how many people protest, no matter what happens, I mean, as we're watching the world right now, things are only getting worse. We're finding more and more and more huge pockets of inequality. It's not going away. And I think many of us believe, you know, with the next election, I mean, we have Jim Jordan as Speaker of the House right now. And all I remember about him was, you know, I couldn't stand the guy watching the Christine Blasey Ford debacle and everything he said and did. And now he's possibly going to be Speaker of the House.
I thought it
Things
was
are only
already
going to get
released. I thought it was already decided.
no, he stepped down, and now Jim
Oh.
Jordan. I'm like, oh no. I just looked at my husband and I said, well, this is the end. He wasn't disagreeing with me at that point, you know. I got a good view of his character during the Christine Blasey Ford situation. I haven't heard much of him since, and I know I read something a little bit about his past. He was involved with a
Let's keep on
wrestling
topic
team.
here.
Yeah.
Let's keep on topic. So, I mean, that's a example of how the personal is political, and he's a witness to how there's the difference in our view of personal is political. But what Elder Parminder, what God is trying to get us to see right now is just how equality looks like. How equality looks like inequality. So this is where I'm wanting more feedback, more ideas, more.
I got a thought, Alyssa.
Go ahead, Carol. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Eve was taken from Adam's rib. So wouldn't there be a little bit of inequality there?
Right. So this is where we're needing to have more visibility on what this equality means. If we at the end of the world are saying that men and women are equal, we have to reconcile that with the reality of how it's written that they were created and equal. Care to say more, Carol?
No, that's it. My thoughts.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you for the observation. Okay, so Penny and Bob, I'm catching up on the chat posts. Penny, Bob, and Mavis. As stated, the rib protects the heart, lungs, and a fractured rib is extremely painful. Let that be a lesson to all. And then Susie from Jamaica says they were both called Adam. Both Eve and Adam at the beginning were called Adam. Just like the animals were both cows, sheep, horses, etc. They were the same regardless of what they were made of. This is how she sees equality. And Anna is saying, could you say there was inequality at the beginning? Lucifer looked more majestic than Christ. Yes, I think that's one of the things that's being brought out here, is that how do we reconcile equality when it doesn't look equal? And then Mary says, even though Adam and Eve were equal in worth, something that Pam brought out last night, the point on value, equality more in value than in physicality. And Mary is building on that. Even though Adam and Eve were equal in worth, physically Eve was weaker than Adam. Lucifer approached Eve from that perspective and made her to feel unequal and different. Yes, they were different in appearance, but together supported each other and were complete. I like that perspective.
Alyssa?
Go ahead, Bob.
I just, when we think of equality, somehow we have this idea that things have to look the same, be the same size, and do everything. So
Mhm.
basically, then we're saying equality has to be that you're a clone. It's just a clone. It's
Right.
identical in every way, and that's not what
Right.
I know. That's and our minds are so geared to think that it has to be equal in, by every size and everything, and everything has to be the same, and it doesn't. Because I think
Right.
if equality, I think what Pam was saying, if it has to do with value and has to do with
Mhm.
being equal in value in God's eyes, then we can see equality and understand what equality really is, and take in the fact that just because there's not variations, there's differences, and those differences are to be admired and recognized for what they are, and again, I think the point's being made that it works together. The whole body
Mhm.
works together. The body of Christ is supposed to be everyone, and we all work together. We all work together. We all have a place or a part that we're playing, that we're supposed to
Mhm.
do, and no one part of the body is greater than the other. It just, I don't know.
Right.
We got to get away from this idea that it's a clone, or they have to be identical in every way in order to be equal. And I think that's
Right.
where we're fighting, and that's where Lucifer was fighting in heaven.
Mhm. Yeah. And because I have seen, I've witnessed that even within myself of trying to see this physical inequality, let's say, I guess what Elder Parminder is saying, to see the parable but make excuses for it rather than like actually dealing with the reality of it. What Troy said, it seems it is in Troy Walker Witt, it seems it is in the internal that is equal, not the external. So internally, within themselves, the value, Adam and Eve's value is equal, the internal. They have the same value. Their externality, their external physical appearance is unequal. Now, if we look at that example in heaven, I think it was a double injury to Lucifer, that both physically and so externally and internally, there were inequalities. Right? Because Lucifer thought he was equal to God, to Jesus. Externally, he definitely knew there were inequalities in the physicality, but being equal was not a reality. And so this is where I guess I have a little bit more, and Elder Parminder at the end of this presentation speaks a little bit more on empathy, of having empathy for the journey, I guess, the internal struggle that Lucifer is having with this. Lucifer has an idea that's supported by his job function as more superior. He sees it as better than whatever Jesus is doing. Sounds like Jesus doesn't look like he's doing much in heaven. So Lucifer sees himself doing more, looking more appealing, looking more majestic, more glorified than Jesus. So in his mind, he's seeing equality until God goes into private counsel. And Lucifer is not welcome in that private counsel. And this is where I think it's especially important for us to understand the 144,000 having its special place within the temple services, that we're the only ones allowed in the temple. So when there's a bunch of people seeing that we're going into this place that they're not allowed into, that there's going to be jealousy and envy. And this makes me wonder if this isn't why the 1,000 years of dealing with interpersonal jealousy and envy within our own selves, of not feeling superior to others that might not have the same understanding that we do, the same beliefs. Not telling them what they need to know as much as answering questions that they might have, because isn't that how God leads? David, you shared a great quote with me on WhatsApp the other day. I'm wondering if you can pull that up and read. I think it was Desire of Ages. And it talked about how, goodness, now it just exited my mind. But how that kind of thought
trying to look it
totally
back
left.
so I can get it right.
Okay. And then Julia says, maybe focus on treating everyone equally rather than trying to look for similarities. Yes. And this is what I think is where the rubber meets the road, where morality meets prophecy, where the political and the personal meet, because we have a responsibility. We're not going, the vast majority of us are not going to be personally affected by the laws. No personal effect.
But we have to have the empathy.
Yes. So there's no personal direct effect to us with these laws around. The biggest one that comes to mind are the anti-trans laws. So there's no personal effect to us, but we have to have empathy.
You know, Alyssa, when you look at Lucifer, there's a couple of things about Lucifer where it appears that he much has the upper hand, because when compared to Michael, he looked so much, more beautiful, and his garments were more beautiful. And when it comes to his responsibility, Lucifer, my understanding is Lucifer was the one who came into the presence of God and was given light, and he was the one who would disseminate it to the rest of the angels. So as far as position, he was like, he had the purpose that God had with him. He was the one who was supposed to disseminate the truth as it was revealed to the rest of the angels. And so I think that Lucifer, part of his test was he was being tested, that he had to realize that he was equal, had no greater value, since we want to use the word value, he had no greater value than any of the other angels. And yet he had the ability to go in with God and be able to understand things and then share it with the rest of the angels. So he had a big head. He was starting to think that, no, I'm better than everybody else. And that was a wrong idea that he had. And that wrong idea, then, when all of a sudden another angel, which happens to be the one who created him, but when Michael, all of a sudden has privilege that he doesn't have, he's saying, wait a minute, I'm the highest one. I've got the upper hand here. And now all of a sudden someone else is getting a privilege that I don't have, because he saw himself as the greatest and the best in every way, which was his test, because he had to realize that when I'll talk about equality, that he was equal with the rest of the angels and he wasn't any better.
And that's where I see him sliding off the mark. Once he started seeing himself better is when that separation started. Trying to read Mary's. Okay, so David, if you don't mind, David, pulling up that quote. So Desire of Ages, page 224.5. I'll give you a minute. Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I'm going to read Mary's while you're pulling that up. We are trying to figure out what equality looks like in heaven when some will be closer to God than others, when some crowns will shine brighter than those of others. How do we deal with jealousy in heaven? Is jealousy a bad thing? Those are good thoughts. Anybody have thought on that? Or David, are you ready to read?
I can read it.
Okay.
It says, this Desire of Ages 224.5, and it's pretty common quote. So I'm sure everyone will recognize it, but it's so encouraging to me. It says, God never leads his children otherwise than they would choose to be led. If they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of God, glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him. That just encourages me, because this path we're on, we know it's getting narrower and narrower, and actually the parable says it gets bloodier. But this is God's plan for us, and we need to take heart knowing that he's there, and he's not going to leave us.
But the thing that I liked, oh, go ahead, finish.
I'm going to say we are going to go through hard times.
So the thing that I liked about that quote is that God never leads God's children without them instructing how they want to be led, is what I take from that.
Yeah.
So God has to get this point across, because we see ourselves as unequal. We see these inequalities between men and women. So for the agitation, for the test to have any effect, it's almost like God is giving us what we're asking for without understanding that we're asking for this. Maybe that's not making sense, but the way that God teaches humanity is in the way that humanity is ready, the way that their mind is conditioned, the way that so God has to work within a very limited framework, if that makes sense, and has to relate to us, has to get us to see what God is trying to teach us, but God has to use it in ways that we can understand. All right, let me get back to the chat comments. Anybody else have a comment they want to make?
I had a thought a while back
Yeah,
when you were talking about Eve and Satan.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that Satan didn't tempt Adam?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because in the Muslim tradition, that's how it happened.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Satan tempted Adam. In their understanding and their revelation that Muhammad received, it wasn't Eve's fault. That's Christian pagan influence.
Interesting.
That's not everywhere. Yeah. They see it as the responsibility was on Adam, and Adam failed, and the failure was compounded by shifting the blame onto women. I find that fascinating. There's maybe a little bit more qualities of radical feminism than I once thought. Keep going.
What about the part where Eve separates from Adam? And was there a cause for that? And was that Adam's fault? I mean, maybe that's what you're getting at.
No, they don't talk about a separation. Noelle, so I have just recently heard that, so I'm not entirely sure of the full revelation on that, the full story that they have. Simply that the sin was not on Eve, on Adam. I'm trying to go to, all right, anybody else have thoughts?
Well, follow up on that. I was just thinking that perhaps when we see Satan or Lucifer tempting Eve, it's like, is this the first time we see it shown that perhaps Lucifer is a sexist? And he's picking on her. Why is he picking on her? Does he see her weaker? You know, what's his mindset on this whole thing?
Mm-hmm.
And then if you follow down his path, well, sexism is like right from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Well, was it right from the beginning?
From the beginning of, let's say, tempting Eve to, decimate our planet.
All right, so I'm going to catch up on the statements people made. Isabel says, God never leads his children otherwise. Oh, you put the paragraph of the desire of ages. That David just read. Thank you for doing that. Gloria says, I think one aspect of equality that Elder Parminder wanted to teach us was in his closing prayer. He said, we need to have sympathy and particularly have empathy for those around us because we may not enter into the same experience as them literally. But God is teaching us that it's necessary to enter into their experience emotionally. Very good. Thank you, Gloria. I do think that was the purpose in illustrating this. And Petty, Bob, and Mavis, this view of being better originated with Lucifer and continues in fallen humanity. We must root it out. Also agree. Sarah, how do we then apply that in real life? Mary, is it because Eve had a visible disadvantage of being smaller and weaker and Satan had some defect to point at? I think that's what David is asking. So is the radical, this is Sarah, so is the radical feminism, as we know, against God's order of equality? Do we know what radical feminism looks like? If we're saying that radical feminism is men and women able to do everything equally, I see that more in our history, that men and women, especially if I look at the African people in most specific, and even in the slave days, women, field slaves, were expected to perform on par with men. Otherwise, horrible things would happen. So I think that there's a view of humanity that I'm still personally wrestling with, as far as where does this view of the stereotypical man, the stereotypical woman that Ellen White points us to, in her writings, where Adam is the bigger and the stronger, and Eve is the weaker and the smaller. I think if that's a accurate picture, I think that would unravel the point. That I think the point is to get to what's God trying to tell us through this illustration of inequality. And Sarah says, so is the radical feminism as we know it against God's order. I already read that. Why is it saying that's new? Okay, all right. So we have the setup from our beginning. We can use it as we can use the word rib, I guess, to symbolize this inequality. Eve was made from parts of Adam rather than taken from fresh dirt. A clone of Adam was not made. A counterpart was made. So what does that counterpart mean then if we are also the counterpart of God? How do we see ourselves? And maybe it diminishes our significance a little bit. And maybe that allows us to have the empathy for others, especially those that are going through the personal test of gender, of sexism, of transphobia, homophobia, oppression of any kind. Gloria says, anybody have any thoughts?
Liz, I have one more point I'd like to share regarding, you look at heaven. We have to realize that in eternity past, sin did not exist at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so at one point, Lucifer, with whatever attributes that he physically had that made him look, greater or bigger or brighter or whatever than the other angels, and the responsibility that he had, the position that God placed him in, there was no sin. There was complete harmony in heaven, and so I just want us to understand that existed that way. And we know in the end, ultimately, when sin is completely eradicated, eventually, we know that God's character is going to be vindicated to the point where there is no reason for sin to have ever even existed in the first place. And those are big things to ponder. And we understand that inequality is, I think we're wrestling with trying to understand what equality means. And I think, that's where Lucifer was trying to understand it. But we know that the first inklings of things leaning in the wrong direction was with Lucifer. And we know that God counseled with him to understand the thoughts or the feelings that he was having. And instead of recognizing it, that was his test, instead of recognizing it for what it was, he wanted to continue to build this idea that somehow he was being wronged. And he wasn't being wronged, but he thought he was being wronged. And even when we know that at one point, according to the spirit of prophecy, that Lucifer was brought in his own mind to understand that the position that he was taking was wrong, and he knew that God was right. And yet he had already promulgated enough of this wrong idea around heaven and blaming it all on God, that he didn't want to back down and admit to the rest of the angelic hosts that he had a wrong idea and that he had misstepped. And so it was because of pride. He didn't want to recognize that God was right, even though he knew God was right, and God had proved to him that God was right. And so that's when where sin came from. But it all has to do with somehow thinking that you have a value that's better than someone else. That's the inequality. And anyway, just another thought to add into the mix here, because sin there was no sin ever before it entered, and we know that there was no purpose, there was no reason for sin to ever happen. Although the very fact that God created the angels and he created human beings as not robots, or puppets, he created us with a free will to choose. And he wants, I think part of the bigger picture is for us to understand that God wants us to choose to serve him out of love for all the different ways that we can see that we're not entirely clones. Okay. And we're supposed to see the value in that and not look at it and see that one person is better than another.
Thank you, Bob. So as Mary points out, and this is where I think our troubles come, is that counterpart means equivalent, duplicate, look-alike. It's like the concept of a fractal, she says. And then Troy Walker, I'm thinking of the brightness of Lucifer to the other angels, because Lucifer was in close communion with God, just as Moses' face lit up. The thought, but I could be wrong. I think that's how I view it also. But going back to Mary, so counterpart equals duplicate. And I wonder if that's kind of where we're getting tripped up. If we're stumbling over seeing counterpart as a clone, and it doesn't look like a clone, so then we get confused. Eve doesn't look like Adam, so how do we have to reconcile the definition of counterpart to the reality of counterpart? It's actually not a look-alike. It's not a duplicate. It's different, but yet having the same value, made by the same hands. Anybody else have a thought as we close? We've reached the hour mark.
I just wanted to make a comment. I think equality, to me, the way God wants us to understand is understanding his character and having the right perspective of his character. I think it goes to the messages, having the right stream, because physical appearance, all that can vary in many ways. But when we think of equality, we think of economic, status or physical appearance. But when we come to the character of God and how we need to become like him, I think we just stand in awe, and we have no comparison, and we just sort of are appreciative of anything, of the light that we get, and just being able to be part of his kingdom, just making it there it will be a privilege, that will give up everything in this world. Yeah. So.
Thank you, Gloria. So you bring up a point that leads me to think, okay, so yeah, we have these two streams of information, and if equality means having the same understanding as God, being on the same stream of information as God, then we know that Lucifer is going to be on that opposite stream, trying very hard to look like the true stream in order to pull more human minds away. Any other thoughts, ideas? Susie says, I've often thought that both Adams was created as intersex. Not saying I'm correct, but I've thought it. I've had a similar thought that before the fall, while they were one, that just like I remember Jesus telling the Pharisees when they were trying to trap him with the question of who does the 8 brothers marry this, or 7 brothers marry this one woman and they all die. Who is she married to in heaven? And Jesus says, you don't know anything. Aren't we like angels when we're in heaven? So that's where I kind of think that we're genderless in heaven. But right now we have this issue of gender to contend with. Mary says, we're hung maybe on similarities, but there's also differences. Adam was similar to Eve and vice versa, but also different. But neither is complete and fulfilled without the other. The dynamics on how they relate to each other is what we are struggling with. Maybe so. And then Lily says, when she thinks of a counterpart, she thinks it's like different parts working different roles, and each part is equally important to helping everything run together. That's where I was seeing like gears of a bicycle. God making Adam, that's like one gear, and then making Eve, it's not a identical second gear, but rather there's a variation. There's a whole bunch of different gears that come after the first one in some models of bicycles. But maybe that's getting off the point a little bit. Anybody have any final thoughts? So to recap, we come to the understanding through Elder Parminder's 3rd video. I think the entire year, the camp meetings have been trying to get us to understand what does equality look like personally as well as politically. He talks about the new gurus, everybody being able to have a personal experience through their phone, through the internet, in contrast to the movement having a group experience. So in this group experience that we're striving, we know that this group experience must look like radical feminism. Then how do we reconcile what equality means when at the beginning in Eden, Eve is made from a rib of Adam, thereby identifying inequality from the beginning. Before that, Lucifer looked more appealing, more majestic than Jesus. Again, another illustration of inequality. But yet we also have this shared nature with God. Humanity is different from all of other creation in the sense that we share a nature with the divine. So at the end, when we look at all of these individuals that are not going into the temple with us, are we going to have a spirit of, well, serves them right? Or are we going to have empathy and compassion and maybe a softer heart of feeling a little bit of the pain that Lucifer went through, that people with mental deficiencies go through on a daily basis of thinking that something is the way that it is, but then reality steps in and gives them another picture. Well, I see that happening in the political arena through the Republicans thinking, I guess either side, but specifically more demonstratively with the Republicans, with the right, with them wanting this king, this ruler over them, and the rest of the people saying, no, that's not the reality that we're wanting to make. Are we going to have an attitude towards them of superiority, or are we going to try and speak with them with tears in our eyes, trying to reason with them as God did with Lucifer? Penny Bob Mavis says equality as taught also means eliminating nationalism, sexism, homophobia. Yes, the wrong stream and idea of equality originated with Lucifer. Okay, any other ideas or thoughts as we close? Any questions? Mary says, in heaven, empathy will be needed.
I just
No
want
thoughts?
to, it gives us a lot to think about and contemplate. Thank you.
You're welcome. There's so much more to this video, the Elder Parminder study. So I highly recommend everyone going through, and the more that I broke down the transcript and organized it in a way that that reflected his words, I started to see that there were a lot more levels of depth that he was trying to get to in helping us to see what this personal and political experience means. We're not all sharing it at the same level, so we have to be on the same level emotionally. And what does that mean? Translates into empathy. And a few more chats. If I can get it to display properly. Okay, I think Anna says, wasn't that what the disciples were struggling with? Who is the greatest? Exactly. Not looking, and this is where Bob in the original study says that we have a wrong understanding of what it means to be a king. The Jews were looking for a conqueror. They were looking for an Apis bull. There are people still today looking for the Apis bull. Think they found him and try and elevate him every chance that they get in the face of 91 felony indictment counts or something like that. Maybe not felony, but criminal counts. Okay, Susie says, empathy needed down here first before we get to heaven. I agree. There was a comment that Elder Parminder made to Kathy Brown about the mind that he would take to heaven. It's the same mind that we have here on earth. So we must learn, how I understand it, is that we must learn these things now, practice them here. That way our mind has like a muscle memory. It has that pathway already established for our hearts to be on the right side of issues, to have empathy, to have the presence of mind to be able to see somebody hurting and just to sit with them rather than try and come up with a solution. Sometimes there's not a solution. Sometimes issues are just too deep, too, like, how do we change it? Looking from as an example, as a resident of Arkansas, how can I possibly change the laws against transgender children and the doctors that seek to treat them? I can sit and I can listen to them. That's the basic. That's the least that I can do. I can tithe. I can send my donation to a place called Lucy's Place, which is in Little Rock, that helps transgender children who are persecuted, that don't have a place to go. Their parents have disowned them, or society. You know, maybe there are politicians that we need to bend the ear of and say, hey, I don't agree with this. As I've tried many times to do, and that's even more frustrating sometimes because the responses back from these politicians are saying that they're not actually listening. They're only to me or to other voices in their constituency. They are listening to their big money donors who are saying Christian nationalism all the way. So this is where our inner struggle might not, or my inner struggle, my inner dealings with the great test may be very different than most of everyone else's, unless you get personally involved, unless you get into the trenches with the LGBTQ community and try and change the laws. How are these events going to affect us? Probably not. Most of you are married, heterosexual, cisgendered individuals. You have no experience as anything different. So the laws that are affecting those that are different, they don't have any impact on the majority of the movement. That doesn't mean that we turn our backs on people, that we respect them any less, that we think of them any less, and I guess I go back to the value, because doesn't God value us all, who he died for, who Jesus died for? Isn't that equal value? None of us could pay that price. Jesus did. And this is where I think Ellen White says heaven is cheap enough. We don't pay for a ticket there. It's given to us. We have to work. We have to prove ourselves. We have to have a changed heart to accept that, to be compatible with the rules and regulations of the kingdom of heaven. We have to have a mindset that God has that allows for appearances of inequality to exist as though there are none, as though there is equality, if that makes sense. Okay. I think we'll call it a study, unless anybody has any final thoughts.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Very welcome, Penny. Glad it was a blessing.
It certainly was.
More than
Thank
just
you,
myself.
Alyssa.
Thank you, Alyssa.
All right,
Yeah.
let's begin with, yeah, Bob?
Thank you, Alyssa. That was really
Right.
good. And I like this last
Good.
part
Thank you, Jim.
explained. Thank you.
Oh, I just
Yeah.
wanted to say one other thing that occurred to me.
Sure, Sue Ellen.
appreciated the remembering about Lucifer, and even though he began to understand things, his pride kept him from letting go, you know. And then it reminded me of pride goes before a fall.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is a very important point in the whole thing of not accepting someone, you know, it's holding on to your own pride or something. You know. That's all.
Thanks for making that point.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Close in prayer. Almighty God in heaven, we thank you for your words. We thank you for your daily nourishment. We thank you for the teachers that are in our lives that help us to see what is so important for us to understand about your kingdom, about how you've created us, how you've created everything, what it means to be the least among us and still have a place in your kingdom, to still be considered equal with you. God, help us to apply this in our daily lives. Help us to, as we encounter those that have different thinking, help us to overcome that desire to have a superior view of them. Help us to overcome our own pride, our own sense of worthiness above others, our own closeness to you. Let us not see that as a wall that separates us from others, but rather an opportunity for them to get to know you in a whole new way. God, touch our hearts the way that we're meant to, so that we can rightfully serve you, so that we can speak truthfully these parables. Give us the right understanding and help us to serve as you have come and served and been the example for us. And all of this I ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for everyone's participation. Greatly appreciate it. And thank you all for your comments.